Hey Crimestituents, I'm hopping on before the episode to remind you that crime in Congress is political but not partisan. We want special guests with a wide range of views and do not endorse policies or positions.
She's Sarah.
She's Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress.
Happy Friday, Crimestituents! I am super excited about this episode because we are discussing the Knoxville Torso Murder with one of the biggest personalities in Congress, Representative Tim Burchett from Tennessee. Burchett is an East Tennessee native, served as mayor of Knox County, and was elected to Congress in 2018, where he serves on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Oversight Committee, and the Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank y'all so much. I've been looking forward to this.
I cannot wait to tell you about this really disturbing crime from your district. But before we do that, we want to help our listeners get to know you a little bit better with some Q&A. So are you ready for a few rapid fire questions?
Yes, ma'am. Fire away.
You went viral for telling a reporter, quote, "I do not support you wearing black socks with short pants." We want to get your opinion on some other fashion rules. How do you feel about white after Labor Day?
Well, not a big fan of white after Labor Day. I'll tell you, my wife always wears white, and she'll say, "Oh, I bet we're going to have spaghetti tonight." I'm no slave to fashion, obviously, with my Carhartt jacket and stuff in the wintertime, but yeah, I dig it.
Carhartt's having a comeback. It's pretty trendy right now.
It's so hip. Over in a buddy of mine went to Paris, France. I got to be careful about saying Paris, because Paris, Tennessee, as you all I'm sure know, is the home of the world's largest fish fry. But in Paris, France, they have in the fashion district, they have like a little Carhartt store over there, and I thought that's very chic. But and they text me and say, "Hey, Burchett, you're a trendsetter," and I go, "Not exactly. I'm just cheap. I'm just cheap."
No, you had it before it was cool.
Thank you.
All right, what about wearing black and navy together?
I always say you never trust somebody whose tie is darker than their suit or something like that. I don't know. I always see these guys wearing a black shirt, black tie, black everything. I can't pull it off. I'm just a dark suit, red tie, white shirt kind of guy.
It's a staple for a reason. It's a classic look. What about sneakers with a business casual outfit?
I'm not a big fan of sneakers, just because, but I understand. I see the ladies, they come to the office in these crazy high heels, and when I hear them clomping down the hall, sound like a bunch of Clydesdales. And I always tell them they would fail out of ninja school because they could not sneak up on me with those. So I dig it, the fact that they wear them to walk over. I think that's cool that they wear their sneakers to walk to work in, because I couldn't. I know I don't wear high heels much around. It just, if I got to go very far.
If you want a good calf workout, get yourself some high heels. And then finally, how do you feel about wearing sweatpants out of the house?
I don't know. My daughter's got this little boy that comes around here, and he's always wearing those dead sweatpants. And I think I just want to choke him out just because he's dating my daughter or trying to. So I don't know. He's a pretty good little kid, I guess, but I'm not a big fan of it.
The sweatpants aren't helping.
Mm-hmm.
No, I guess every time now I see somebody with sweatpants, I always worry that they're in close proximity to my daughter. So
True.
y'all are young ladies. You know them boys are up to no good.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Be careful which ones you pick.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, what would your death row meal be? What would your last meal be?
Well, I thought about that. Now, if it was it depends on the type of execution. If I was going to get electrocuted, it'd be a liquid diet. I'd want good conductivity. I don't want to be. I actually know a guy who got electrocuted in Tennessee Electric Chair. Went to my high school for a short while. Yeah, we used to visit him in the prison stuff and witness to him, kind of a ministry thing. But I don't know. You always hear about death row meals. Most of them don't ever eat the dadgum thing. Because they're so nervous, and they just give it to somebody. But I would probably go all out, a pizza and something cool like that. So I could share it with my buddies on death row. I could just walk down the aisle handing out slices.
Be the most popular guy for the day.
Just, yeah. It'd be a good way to go out, though. Hey, remember Burchett? He brought us pizza.
Yeah, I like that guy. He was pretty cool.
Yeah, he was pretty cool.
All right, this is one of my favorite questions. If you called your chief of staff right now and told them you've just been arrested, would they believe you? And what would they assume your crime was?
Well, Jenny Lingenfelter is my overall chief of staff. She handles the whole thing, and Kelsey Wolfgram is runs my DC operation. So I suspect they'd believe it. They'd probably think somebody got in my face or said something about one of my girls, and I dropped them out on the parking lot. And they'd believe me. I know they go, "What'd you do?" That'd probably be the first thing instead of "Where are you?" So.
I mean, that's good though. They would assume that you were defending someone. I think that's super valid.
Yeah. I'm a lover, not a fighter, but some of those guys cross the line, and gals. They say some pretty horrible things out there, and I can't. And Capitol Hill police have not been around several times when somebody's crossed the line. And that bothers me, but I'll leave it at that. But I'm not bitter.
So do you have any funny stories about being pulled over as a member of Congress?
I remembered when I got pulled over one time when I was in the state legislature, and it was where there was it had changed from like 70 to 55. I mean, it's just right there. The sign was right there, and the officer was right there, and he pulled me over, and he said, "Do you know what the speed limit in Tennessee is?" And I had just passed raising the speed limit to 70 miles an hour. It was me. It was actually me and Steve Cohen, if you can believe that.
Wow.
Steve used to be a big libertarian, and he was in the state Senate. I was in the state house. And I remember I was in my pickup truck, and I looked at that officer, and I said, "Dadgummit." I said, he said, "You know what the speed limit is in Tennessee?" And I said, "Well, actually, sir, officer, I'm the one who said it." And he looked at me, and he said, "You are." And he said, "Just keep it down under whatever it was." It was where it had changed, and he let me go. And I was like, thank goodness. So, that's about the best story I got.
That's great. That's a big power play there.
Yeah. And that was probably, maybe 20 years ago.
We were told that you have a very interesting hobby involving bamboo. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I make skateboards, and dadgummit, hang on, I'm gonna grab it. I got one right here that I made. This one actually is not bamboo. I've got one out in the garage, but this is a skateboard I made out of. I got a picture of AOC holding it, if you can believe that. She's like, where'd you get that longboard? I said, I made it. And she said, what? And I said, yeah, I made that dadgum thing. But I make skateboards out of bamboo. Can I tell you how I got started with bamboo? Is that all right?
Oh my gosh, please.
Okay. So I played football when I was in high school. I was a captain of the 1982 Bearden High School football team. We went 5-5. You might have heard of me. Anyway.
Absolutely.
So about 1980, I was on the Bearden High School football team. I was a sophomore, and they called me Flea, like the insect, because I was the smallest guy on the team, and by a long shot. And I was always just beat up, man. We'd have 2-a-day practices. It was back in the old days, and they didn't, there was no concussion protocol or anything like that. And I was just so banged up, and I would sit on the couch in between practices. I'd come home, and my mama would, bring me something to eat or drink, and I just lay there, and I would read National Geographic. And there was this great article on bamboo, and I read it cover to cover, and bamboo has always fascinated me, and I've experimented with it since then. And now I make them pretty cool.
How can someone get their hands on a handmade skateboard from you?
Yeah, by a congressman. There's not a lot of those out there. I dare say I cracked the mold on that one. But it was funny. I'm at the Capitol with that one, and Steve Cohen honked at me, and he pulled up in that old Cadillac of his, which I've actually fixed before. He couldn't get started one time, and I fixed it for him. But I grabbed onto his door handle and just rode out into the parking lot. And somebody actually videoed it, some reporter. And then, you get Burchett's playing around while we're losing our country, and all that stuff. Like, please, nobody gives a rip. They do, Anyway.
So do you believe that the Capitol is haunted?
I've heard that. I'm a Christian. I don't get too worried about that stuff. You open yourself up to I think demonic possession, if you will, or suggestion if you're not good with the Lord and Jesus. So I don't really worry about that. I've heard people say that. I actually sleep in my office, and I thought it was being haunted, but it turns out it's that crazy. It's a machine that they use to polish the dadgum marble floors every night. It's a Zamboni. It's that thing at the hockey matches.
All right, we have 2 more questions for you. My last question for you is, what's one thing that isn't a crime but you think should be? For me, it's when you're at the gym and you see someone using a machine and then they just get off of it without wiping it down and leave it all sweaty. I think that's super gross. So I would be in support of that being a crime.
I'm going to have to agree with you on that. That would be at the top of my list. I think when I'm at the all-you-can-eat pizza buffet and somebody grabs a piece of pizza and then they put it back.
Ooh, no.
Yeah, that's what I'm waiting. I'm always waiting. I always special order thin crust sausage, extra cheese, and then when they call it out, I'll run up there because I know it's fresh. And the professional eaters haven't put their greasy fingers on it yet. You got to be careful though. Somebody could, if you're at a certain all you can eat establishment, somebody could mistake your thumb for like a chicken, a chicken one. And then you pull back a nub, then you're like, hey, where'd all my skin go? So I call those people professional eaters.
That's good. All right, we have one more question and then we'll get into the actual case. Do you have any bills related to our criminal justice system or policing or public safety that you want to tell our listeners about?
People are big on genealogy, checking their history and where they come from. When I was a kid, a guy named Alex Haley wrote a book called Roots, and then they had a TV special. And he went back, traced it all the way, his history back to Africa, and then slavery, and then all the way up to the present time. But I have a bill. It deals with, you send what you do is DNA. You swab your inside of your mouth or something like that, and they find out, you're related to some African king or something, or royalty in England. Everybody, it goes back in time. They never find out that they're, my great granddad was a horse stealer or something. They're always some kind of top of their league. But anyway, Chinese are using that to create a genome, which is basically just a history of our genetic life. And so they could actually create a disease. I know that's far-fetched that they would create a disease, especially since we just come off off of the COVID, as we say here in East Tennessee. But they could create a disease or an infection that would just infect, say, ladies of childbearing ages, and they could literally stop this country from literally almost existing in the course of a generation. So, and I cannot get the dadgum bill out of committee. I can't get it even heard. And I know the K Street lobbyists are involved. I couldn't get it out under the Democrats, and now I can't get it out under the Republicans, and it's very frustrating to me. So I know that's not criminal justice, and I'm always, I pass a lot of bills dealing with child molesters and things like that, and child porn and things, people that would harm in Tennessee. Actually passed the death penalty in the state Senate. They ruled it unconstitutional. But I figured they give those kids a life sentence. They ought to meet their maker. So I'm kind of adamant about things like that.
Thank you for playing along with our questions. But unfortunately, the fun is over and we got to talk about the Knoxville Torso Murder.
Right.
It's the day before Thanksgiving, 1977, Wednesday, November 23rd. In Knoxville, Tennessee, when Reba Hurst arrived from work and noticed her ex-husband, 54-year-old Paul Wayne Hurst, wasn't home like he normally would be at that time. Even though the two were divorced, the couple still shared a home in Maryville and slept in different bedrooms. It sounded like their relationship was friendly enough. The two had actually been out together the night before for dinner, but they weren't married anymore, and Paul is his own person, which is why Reba didn't worry too much when he wasn't home that Wednesday evening. Adding to her lack of concern was the fact that Paul had actually taken that entire week off work and was said to be planning a trip, meaning he was off of his normal routine anyway. Despite the fact that I gave you his full government name, Paul was not a serial killer. He worked as a chemical operator at the K-25 plant operated by Union Carbide in Oak Ridge, which would actually be shut down 10 years later for environmental concerns. In case you're unfamiliar, K-25 is code name for facilities that were producing enriched uranium for atomic bombs. But this was not Paul's first or even most successful career. Paul was actually a well-known boxing coach in the area and won the welterweight Golden Gloves championship in the early 1940s. A fellow boxing legend, Ace Miller, described Paul as a, quote, tough customer. The former president of the Golden Gloves said of Hurst, "I can't feature anybody taking him on without getting a lot of damage."
Okay, so this guy knew how to fight.
Exactly. Paul retired from the boxing scene himself, but continued to be an active presence in Knoxville's boxing scene. He coached youth boxing and founded a youth boxing program in the Maryville-Alcoa area and his own boxing program as well. He also coached the Everett High School boxing team and the Fraternal Order of Police team in Maryville. By all accounts, he was respected in the community, and young boxers really looked to Paul as a mentor. Like I said, no alarm bells were going off when Paul kind of went MIA at first. Thanksgiving was the next day, but if his family was alarmed that he didn't join them for dinner, they at least weren't concerned enough to start any searches or notify authorities. When Paul didn't show up to take his young boxers to a match on Saturday, some eyebrows were starting to raise. But when he didn't arrive at work the following Monday, which was extremely out of character, his brother called the police and reported the former boxer as missing. What the Hursts didn't know yet was that the police knew exactly where Paul was, or at least pieces of Paul. You see, that Saturday, November 26th, two teenage boys were out for either a hike or to go hunting in Cherokee Bluffs when they stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Congressman, are you familiar with the Cherokee Bluffs area?
I'm familiar with everything you said so far.
Awesome. I hope I'm pronouncing everything correctly.
You got it. You got it. Ace Miller was a buddy of mine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was Golden Gloves. He managed a guy named Big John Tate, who was a world championship, got knocked out in the final round here in Knoxville. It was a big deal. But yeah, and I helped Ace. I remember when I was in state legislature, I got the unbelievable amount of money of $5,000 for his Golden Gloves arena. And I bought him some bleachers. They needed some real bleachers, and I got him some bleachers. Ace, his name's still on the Golden Gloves arena up there.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Well, the boys were out Cherokee Bluffs, and they were only 14 and 15 years old, but stumbled upon a naked, dismembered torso about 100 yards off Cherokee Trail on the road that led to the home of the Rose family, who had died prior to the crime. This torso was discovered around 8:30 a.m.
This is why we stay out of the woods.
Exactly.
Especially love a good hike, but 14 and 15, can you imagine? Oh.
Mm-mm. No, and if you don't go on hikes, you can't find bodies that were dumped on trails.
That's true. You don't do that when you just walk in your backyard. You don't find the torsos.
Exactly. Or if you do, you know how it got there. If it's in your own backyard.
Yeah.
Once investigators arrived on the scene, they were stunned. Chief of Detectives Bill Wilson said at the time, "This is without a doubt the worst case I've seen in my 11 years on the force. I've worked all kinds of murders and suicides, but this is definitely the worst." The scene was as gnarly as it was bizarre. The torso was bound with a ski rope that had been thrown from either a car or a truck onto the roadside. The white man appeared to be in his mid-20s or 30s, was 5'6" to 5'8" and weighed about 160 pounds. Blood patterns on the ground confirmed the police's theory that the man had been killed in a different location and dumped at this site. Rigor mortis, which is the stiffening of the body that happens after death, hadn't fully set in, which led them to assume that the torso had only been there about 6 to 8 hours. Police estimated that the victim had probably been killed either late Friday night or early Saturday morning. And yes, it was just the victim's torso that was found. The man's head, hands, legs, and genitals had been removed. Initially, investigators believed that this was done with a chainsaw. The hands and wrists were, quote, severed below the elbow, and his legs had been cut off about 3 inches above the knees. There were some additional wounds that looked like the killer had tried to remove an identifying scar or tattoo or something. His remains were also badly bruised. Unfortunately, police were not able to determine whether the victim had been alive when he was dismembered. Let's hope he was not. The state of the body left the investigators to conclude that the crime was likely personal because of how much time someone would have had to spend with the body after he was killed, and the genitals being removed suggested that this was a targeted personal attack. To quote David Davenport, retired cold case investigator for the Knox County Sheriff's Office, it was personal, very. Removal of genitals usually indicated, in cases I've solved, jealousy, cuckolding, or vindictiveness. Initially, Knox County Detective Charles Smith believed that the motive may have been either sex or drugs. Congressman, what is your initial reaction to all of this?
Well, growing up in Knoxville, I could remember it very well. You see the torso murders, and that was kind of I mean, when you're at Beard Junior High School, murder usually isn't the topic, but when it is, it's going to stay. So yeah, we were all kind of shocked. I mean, it was brutal for our area, and we got to realize this is the 70s.
With zero identifying information available to them, police' first task was to figure out whose torso this was.
Right, and I would assume it's hard to search for a killer when you don't even know who the victim is.
Exactly. They needed to identify this man, and quickly. An autopsy was scheduled, but police weren't going to wait around for those results. Quoting Detective Smith, "It was an awfully brutal thing to see. After looking at it, I think there's a maniac out there somewhere." By Monday the 28th, police were combing through missing persons records to see if anyone reported missing matched their John Doe. They asked the public to let them know if anyone matching the man's description was missing, and on this day, the Hursts decided to call police. While the case was certainly making waves in local news, the Hursts likely weren't too concerned that the torso belonged to their missing family member. Remember, police thought this man was in his 30s or younger, and Paul was in his mid-50s. As police were knocking out potential IDs one by one, the results of the autopsy came through and gave them a little bit more to work with, but emphasis on little. The victim hadn't been dismembered with a chainsaw as was initially expected. Instead, his body appeared to have been carefully taken apart with a fine-tooth saw. What's interesting about this is that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was actually in theaters at the time, which is probably why that's where police's minds went first.
When you said that, I remember they showed the type of saw on the news that would have been used, and I think then people started thinking it might have been a butcher or something that did it because they could cut cows and things like that with it. So yeah, I remember. It's all coming back to me.
Adding to the creepiness was that the police said the body parts were, quote, neatly severed and cut apart with much care, which kind of gives credence to that butcher idea that this person knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
During the autopsy, they also learned that the victim had a very rare blood type, O negative. This was big because finally they had some sort of identifying information about their victim. They also found some lacerations on the abdomen and could tell that the victim had a damaged spine. Police hoped that this new information would lead to a big break in the case, and even announced a $10,000 reward for information. But nearly a week after the body was found, the police were no closer to identifying the torso than they were on day one, and started widening the scope of their investigation. They also weren't any closer to finding the rest of their victim. As a little aside, police briefly believed that a man from Kingsport was their victim, but he ended up being alive and just went MIA for a while. That led the Kingsport Times News to run this incredible line: lesson, don't keep your relatives wondering about your whereabouts when there's a full-scale probe underway into a mysterious death.
Yeah, that's probably good life advice. Yeah.
I know when I'm going to be gone for 3 or 4 days and not tell anybody, people tend to question it too. I try not to do that around mass murders or things like that.
That's smart. And I'm sure your staff loves when you do that too.
They do. I just I leave the phone at home and go, no, I don't either.
Since Paul still hadn't turned up, which was not normal for him, police started to suspect that this body could belong to him. DNA technology wasn't around at the time, but the medical examiner was able to obtain copies of spinal x-rays from a back surgery Hurst had to treat an injury. The medical examiner compared the x-ray to the victim's spine, and 1 week after the mysterious torso was found, they were able to identify their victim as Paul Wayne Hurst.
So are spines unique enough to make certain identifications like that?
You could probably, it's sort of like dental records. You could probably, that's just good old fashioned police work though.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And when they compared them, they found 15 distinct matching features between the victim and the x-ray. But do you all know what blood type Paul had?
Oh, negative.
Oh, negative.
And what about age though? Didn't they think the victim was in his mid-30s?
Yes, but I think there's an explanation there. For starters, I don't think there's an exact science to telling someone's age based off their torso. Second, Paul Hurst was a fit man. Even though he retired from boxing, he is still said to have exercised every morning and was a teetotaler, which means he might have had the physique of a much younger man. Paul Hurst's funeral was held on Monday, December 5th. He was survived by his sons, Paul Wayne Hurst Jr., who goes by Sonny, Alan Stephen Hurst, his daughter, Nancy Stinnett, 2 brothers, a sister, and 2 grandchildren. While the police finally had an ID for their John Doe, it kind of left them with more questions than answers. To start, no one had a bad word to say about Paul, and the family immediately shut down any notion that this could have been related to drugs. According to his son, he'd raised total hell talking about kids drinking or smoking pot. I never saw him take a drink, and he was against drugs. To give you more of a sense of who Paul was, his son, Sonny, shared the following story. Congressman, can you read this quote for us?
Daddy started in the boxing program in 1962. He saw a kid in cutoff pants and old tennis shoes. They were so worn out they had to be taped on his feet. And he told the kid, if you want to box that bad, I will see to it that I get you trunks, shoes, and a place to train.
So he was really dedicated to the community and making sure that every kid who wanted to had an opportunity to succeed in athletics.
Apparently, yeah. He had a reputation of that.
On top of there being no discernible reason for someone to want Paul dead, it was also hard for his family to believe that someone would have been able to attack him, given his reputation and fighting skills. The family was confused and in disbelief, to say the least. They speculated that he had to have been shot or caught off guard. Despite the brutality of this crime, it almost immediately went cold. 2 months later, that puts us in January 1978, the Knox, Blount, and Anderson County Sheriff's offices were working the case. Because they knew the body had been dumped at the site, they didn't have a set location for the actual crime scene, which is why multiple agencies were working on it. Police conducted more than 100 interviews, and a total of $15,000 of rewards were offered up in exchange for information leading to an arrest. But no matter how many trees investigators shook, they couldn't come up with a suspect, or even a motive for that matter. They still had to do their due diligence, though, and upon searching the Hurst home, police collected some items that could be important in the future. This included a hatchet, saw, mattress, and box springs. Interestingly, they also found a .25 caliber shell casing underneath the bed, but no gun. These items were sent off to the FBI testing lab in Washington, D.C. to be examined for signs of blood, but police didn't seem to expect to find anything. They needed to check the boxes, but there weren't any telltale signs that these items were linked to the crime. By January 24th, the reward money now totaled $25,000. Today, that would be more than $120,000. Months would go by, but eventually the FBI would find no traces of blood or other significant evidence on the items taken from the Hurst home. All right, I have a question for both of you. Based on the information I've given you this far, how confident would you say that this torso belongs to Paul?
95%.
Okay.
I would say 100%. I think they had some other identifying characteristics on the torso.
Investigators agreed with you, and they were 100% confident that they had their guy. But as weeks turned to months and police were no closer to finding any answers, the family started to get frustrated with the investigation. By September 1978, the family was starting to doubt that the torso belonged to their father and requested that his body be exhumed for further examination. Part of the reason for this was that, shockingly, police never released an autopsy report, not even to the family. Quoting his son, Sonny Hurst, "From day one, the investigation has been bungled all the way through. This is the poorest investigation I've ever seen." He, Sonny, would take the reins for the Hurst family because he actually had a prior career as a private detective. The body was exhumed in September, and the results of the second autopsy were as startling as the crime itself. Congressman, can you read excerpts from this news article dated Wednesday, September 27th?
Yes, authorities in 2 counties are in apparent disagreement over the identity of a mutilated torso found last fall in South Knox County. Blount County authorities announced Tuesday that it is conclusive that the body the examination was performed on is not that of Paul Hurst Sr. The torso remains unidentified. Paul Hurst Sr. is now listed as a missing person.
This man had a funeral. His family had spent the past year mourning him, and now police are saying that he could be alive and the partial body they buried belongs to someone else.
Now, what led them to that conclusion?
The Hurst family doctor was present for the second autopsy, and there were a few inconsistencies. First, the doctor had performed a surgery to do vein work on Paul's legs near the right lower abdomen, but upon examination, no signs could be found that the surgery was ever done. In fact, veins that had been removed were still there, and his doctor said, quote, "Veins don't grow back." He had also received a smallpox vaccine, and the scar that it leaves behind was not present on the body. But there's a lot more. An examination of the man's legs led the examiner, Dr. Yarborough, to conclude that the victim was likely older than Paul, around 58 or 59. The body had a scar that was consistent with a hernia operation, and Paul never had a hernia operation. Another interesting tidbit is that apparently Paul always shaved his armpits, and when the body was discovered, it had almost 3 inches of armpit hair. The real kicker, though, are y'all ready for this one?
No.
Was that the torso had a double nipple on the right side, and Paul didn't. Can y'all think of any scenario where someone ends up with an extra nipple post-mortem?
Very James Bondish. There was a James Bond where a guy had a double nipple, I believe.
I haven't seen that one.
But I'd actually have never heard of a double nipple until this was going on. So, you know. But then again, it was 1978, so who knows?
Fair. So with this new information, where are y'all at? Is this Paul?
I don't think it's Paul.
I just think there's inconsistencies. I think it was Paul, but that's just me. I don't know. You know, hair grows after you die.
That's true.
And so I don't know that was there. I don't know about the double nipple. How long was the body in the ground before they exhumed it too? And I mean, your body just rots. Incredibly. 90 days is pretty much you're gone at that point. But if you're underground, especially, but I don't know how he was. How the body was prepared or anything, or if it was in fact prepared at all. So, and I don't know that a scar would show up at veins and things like that. The whole thing was just back then, you know, you didn't know because we didn't know. People didn't normally exhume bodies that had been buried. So, yeah, there's a whole lot of questions about this thing I can remember back then.
Well, after those inconsistencies were discovered, the Hursts were pissed and wanted this unidentified torso out of their family's mausoleum. They believed, quote, beyond a shadow of a doubt that the torso did not belong to their missing loved one. Despite these findings, though, the Knox County authorities insisted that the body did in fact belong to Paul Hurst and were not changing the course of their investigation. Dr. Lash, who performed the initial autopsy, didn't have an explanation for all of the inconsistencies, but he did note that the saphenous vein scar can be easily mistaken for a hernia scar. And for the smallpox vaccine, that scar can fade over time, meaning lack of a scar isn't enough to say for sure that this is or isn't Paul. But if the torso doesn't belong to Paul, then where the heck is he? And also, whose torso is this? The Hurst family, having no faith in the police by this point, hired their own private investigator, Raymond Anderson. He, like the people of Knoxville at the time, believed that because there was controversy over who the victim was, the proper steps to investigate the murder, they weren't just not being taken, they couldn't happen because they were having to spend a lot of time on the actual victim himself. Raymond Anderson was able to find something interesting in his own investigation, though. Congressman, can you read this excerpt explaining what he found?
Yeah, sure. Anderson pulled from an evidence pouch 2 short sections of rope, which he said were the pieces of rope tied around the torso when it was discovered. He said one of the sections was clean while the other was dirty, leading him to surmise that one section was tied to a dock and the other to a boat. Anderson speculated that the torso victim was involved with organized crime and the body may have been dismembered as a warning to others. And Dr. Lash up there, I knew Dr. Lash. He was very well respected. He here in this community, so I would his opinion I would hold it in high regard.
That's really important insight. It's now October 1978, 11 months after the torso was discovered, and instead of looking for a murderer, the police are arguing over the victim's identity. That's when they decided to do a third autopsy. This one would be done by both counties, and hopefully they would be able to come to the same conclusion. Frustratingly, though, that is the last press mention of Paul Hurst for 2 years. If this third autopsy was conducted, there is no reporting on it. Paul wouldn't pop back up in the news again until 1980, when serial killer Nikki Todd Sutton was arrested, and people speculated he may have been involved in the murder or had knowledge of the murder. Do you remember when that happened too?
Actually, I didn't disclose this to y'all, but Nick Sutton was the guy I used to go visit in prison.
No
Really?
way.
Yeah, I knew Nick. He was executed. Let's see, a couple of years ago here in Tennessee. My staff was afraid I was going to go down there because I knew him, and they thought that would scar me forever to watch him get executed. So they scheduled a night that I had to open for him in another county, so there was no way I could get there. So yeah, I remember all of this very much so. But wow. He had killed, I think, 3 people at that point that we knew of.
Wow. And you said you went there for ministry, is that right?
Yeah, I was worried about his soul. He got saved before he died, but it was he committed the murders and about that time, I guess. And then he was let's see, there was a time lapse there that he'd actually done the murders, and I believe in about 1980 they just assumed, well, he killed some people and he killed this guy. But the people he killed, one was his grandmother and the other was a drug dealer. There was always a reason for the killings, and then he killed the guy in prison. Oddly enough, that's the one he got the death penalty for, was killing I believe it was a convicted child molester, actually, that he killed in prison. So wow. that was the one he got the death penalty for, not the other 2. But yeah, it didn't fit in. But anyway, go ahead. I don't want to give it all away. You go ahead.
No. You're totally fine. This is some amazing insight. But you're right. Nothing would ever come of this lead. People were interested, but nothing came of it. The case remained ice cold until 1984, when the FBI decided to take it on, believing that the local police had exhausted every possible lead. The article announcing that the FBI would be re-examining the case mentioned that the state forensic anthropologist confirmed that the body did belong to Hurst, but I'm not sure if they're referencing the first autopsy or if that third autopsy was conducted and that's where they came to this conclusion. And that is where the case stayed until 2019, 42 years after the torso was found. Now, it's not clear to me when police learned this. They definitely knew it well before the public did, but the earliest reporting I could find on it was 2019. Apparently, Paul Hurst had a, quote, surprisingly active social life and managed to, quote, juggle several girlfriends. This is interesting since his genitals had been removed and police suspected early on that cuckolding could have been a motive for the crime. Quoting from that article, Knox County Sheriff's Office's archived investigative file includes an unconfirmed report that Paul Hurst's younger son, Steve Hurst, was upset about his father's affairs and bugged the home phone, supposedly at his ex-wife Reba Hurst's request, to eavesdrop on those conversations. By the time this report was made public, both Reba and Steve had passed away. Congressman, do you remember when that information sort of started coming out about Paul?
Yeah, I did, but Knoxville's not that big. It's the smallest big town you'll ever know. There's not a lot of secrets. I mean, there was talk of all this back then, of now. I mean, of course, the press would probably be the last ones to know.
Mm-hmm. Were there ever conversations about his family being involved?
Yeah, I mean, right went through it was, of course, the drugs, and then it was a killing to, there was, and that was easily disproved, the drug thing, and then, of course, getting his genitals cut off. That wasn't. I don't believe that was quite as much talked about as it would be now.
Fair.
And in the law enforcement was more tight-lipped. They weren't forced to bring stuff out, and like they are now, the sunshine doesn't quite shine as much.
In that same article from 2019, a potential person of interest was also raised. I promise this is the last piece of homework we're going to ask you to do, Congressman, but can you read this for us?
Yes, ma'am. The case file also reveals details of an interview conducted by Knox County Sheriff's Office personnel and a Knoxville-based FBI special agent who was a confidential informant who came forward in 1985. The unidentified man said he had worked at a local junior college years before with Steve Hurst, and as well as a strange character he identified as Richard Russell, a short-tempered man who drank heavily, always carried a handgun, and boasted he had been a mercenary in Vietnam. During a night out drinking together, the informant claimed Russell confided that he had killed Paul Hurst for sneaking around with Russell's girlfriend.
The case file doesn't indicate whether they were able to find and question Russell, or frankly, if this man even exists. And despite this confession, that's where the case remains today. There has never been a named person of interest, let alone a suspect, and a motive continues to elude investigators. The dismembered body parts have also never been found. Sonny Hurst, who is still alive today, has had to watch his family members pass, never seeing a resolution to this case. Because his father never turned up again, and all of his own investigations have similarly turned up nothing, he has actually changed his tune and now believes that the torso does belong to his father. The torso was reburied in an unmarked grave, and the mystery continues to haunt Knoxville to this day. So what do you all think? Do they know who this guy is? What are your thoughts?
Knoxville, there's been several murders in Knoxville and disappearances and things that have happened, and it is just a different time now than it was. You couldn't get by with this today. I mean, with all the Ring cameras, for goodness sakes. I knock on doors and people will send me videos that I don't even know were taken of me walking down the road or something, and said, "Hey, Burchett, is this you? You just came here just in our neighborhood or on my parents' front porch or something." So I mean, you got to realize when this was, and we've grown light years in our forensic science and things like that. So obviously something like that, I don't think would ever happen today. You'd have to completely dispose of a body to destroy in some like a hot fire or something to destroy the DNA, but there's always some other record. So to me, it was always just a mystery. And it's one of those things, unless you have a deathbed confession, you're not going to find out anything. What I suspect is that the family members know now, and maybe they just don't want it out, and they just let it go.
I think all in all, I definitely think it was Paul in hindsight. I think the congressman was right about the inconsistencies, and then you kind of explained too about how some of those inconsistencies can be explained, right? So I do think unfortunately it was Paul, and I don't know that that story about Russell shooting him after a night of heavy drinking, that also kind of makes sense to me as well.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I find interesting that no one talks about is that Paul was last seen by Reba on Tuesday night, and his body was estimated to have been killed Friday night or Saturday morning, which makes me wonder if Paul was held somewhere before he was killed.
Yeah, I think that was part of the speculation too, because of the body being bruised and all. And it was called a crime of passion kind of thing. That's what folks sort of thought it was. And that's, from what I understand, for some detectives, old detectives, I think that's probably what led them to that. It was nothing more than that, and it was just brutal. It was awful.
Have you heard of any plans to re-exhume the body and test DNA just for a certain identification?
No, I guess they could, but no, I have not. That would have to be, I would say, at the request of the family. They'd probably have enough at this point.
So, Congressman, will you be hiking in Cherokee Bluffs anytime soon?
Ma'am, I don't go to the bathroom without a pistol, so I don't. And I'm very much, so I always tell my family, always be aware of your surroundings. I'm very cautious. I have my dad's somehow some of his insight. He always tells me, when you go into a situation, be very aware where you're at, people around you, and how to get out if you have to. And on January 6th, that's exactly what I did. I stayed right where I was because I did not know what was beyond those doors, what was going on. I was afraid if they'd have been waiting on us, they would have been the perfect scenario, run us out one set of doors, and then it'd have been a turkey shoot. And I stayed there to fight, actually. So I was technically, I was the last person to leave the House floor, last House member to leave the House floor. But I was, I could hear my dad, not, he wasn't some spiritual thing, but I know he's in heaven, but I could hear him say, just be calm, buddy. You know what to do. And he would say, just analyze, figure out what, he wouldn't say analyze. He just figure out what you got to do to get out of there, and who's trying to get at you. And I did. And I was, oddly enough, I lived to tell about it. I've got the pictures to prove it. So anyway, but no, the thing about all this is now is that, forensic science is so far advanced. I do remember when they first came out with that, they said it was a chainsaw because of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and all that. And I think he died very horrific. I think it was very awful. But and I remember that they thought Nick had been involved in it because of him being a killer, but that wasn't his style. It was, I think he shot one guy and drowned somebody else and stabbed somebody in prison. And that was his 3 murders. So I can remember that as well. Anyway, that brought back a lot of memories.
Hopefully they weren't too traumatic memories.
I'm good, ma'am.
Well, good. We're glad. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It was great to hear your insight and all your memories and stuff. I think that added a lot to the story.
A couple other stories. There was a Knoxville madam in the 60s, early 60s. That was, I believe she was murdered. And I believe in Sequoia Hills, and there was a lot about it. There's been a police officer was shot when he was on his Harley Davidson. And that murder was never solved. And we've had a couple of people disappear in the Smoky Mountains. One actually was in school she went to my high school, I was in junior high then. I was in school with her sister in junior high. But if you ever do anything, her name's Trini Gibson, and it's a crazy story. You ought to pull that up. And if you want to do a mystery, you can do about a 3-parter on that. And I can tell you what, I mean, she just was in the Smoky Mountains on a field trip and on a trail and just disappeared.
I'm looking it up now.
Trini Gibson.
Sounds like we're going to have you back on the podcast someday then.
I would love that. I love this stuff. And thank y'all so much. Y'all make me feel a little better about where our country's headed.
Oh, thank you. Congressman, can you gavel us out?
Hey, you know what? Hold on a second. I've got a gavel. Hang on.